Okay. I'm Beth Robb, I'm chair of the subcommittee on community corrections. We do need to call roll for the members of the subcommittee. I see Elena Catano here, John Mackey, Steve Sawyer, Jerry Butler, Doug Marlowe by phone, myself. Is there anybody else who's actually on the committee? Okay, and other commission members, I know Chairman Heaton. Any other commission members on the phone or present in the room? All right, we're ready to call the meeting to order, and I'd like to introduce John Mackey, Executive Director of the Criminal Justice Information Authority, to introduce our presentation today.
Yeah, Mr. I'll be brief. First of all, I want to thank Mark Kleiman from NYU and Angela Hawken from Pepperdine for bearing with us here as we navigate technology. So let's jump right in. Mark's professor at NYU. He's recently there, the director of the Crime Reduction and Justice Program, the Merit Institute. Angela Hawken, a professor of public policy at Pepperdine, the director of the Swift, Certain, Fair Resource Center for the U.S. Department of Justice. Both of them are very amazing researchers and practitioners in the field, and I'm really happy that they're here with us today to share their work on swift, certain, and fair sanctions. Mark, and we'll turn over to you guys.
John, thanks very much. And thanks to all of you for your patience. I don't want you to get the impression that just because we couldn't manage a video hookup, we're incapable of completely fixing the criminal justice system in the United States. That would be a rash conclusion to draw. Ground rules, I can sort of see you, but only barely. And you're, I'm sure, all too polite to interrupt. But John can see you, and John lives for the purpose of interrupting me. So nothing's more boring than the sound of one voice. So instead of holding questions and comments to the end, I will encourage you to interrupt as we go through. Just wave to John and he will stop me, and you can ask your question. I'll do some amount of time and turn things over to Angela, and then we'll be back to me. This starts out on fairly familiar ground. First page, first slide you've got in front of you. We have astonishing incarceration rates. American exceptionalism is something to be proud of. This is not one of the things we're proudly exceptional about. We run about 5 times our own historical incarceration rate, and about 7 times the rate of Canada or Western Europe. We are well past the point of diminishing returns in corrections. Adding people to the correctional system probably had value when we had 500,000 prisoners. The next prisoner we added probably reduced crime some. But having quintupled our population, we're now well into the range of people who aren't actually worth keeping behind bars. Even if you put aside the fact that increasing the prison population so that in some neighborhoods going to prison is now a normal feature of adult life for men, greatly reduces the stigma and therefore reduces the deterrent value. So the best estimates we've seen are that the stage we're now at, adding 1 more prisoner probably somewhat increases crime. Still, it's not the case that we can get out of our current box simply by letting harmless people out. I mean, that's the message of Orange is the New Black and the message of the New Jim Crow, and I wish it were true, but it's not. 51% of the people behind bars in the U.S. are serving time for a violent crime, and a substantial fraction of the other 49% have violent crimes in their past. It's true that we're exceptional on incarceration. We're also exceptional on crime. We have about 4 times the homicide rate of any country to which we'd like to compare ourselves. So we have not 1 problem, but 2. We can have a continuing high crime problem. We have a continuing, or recent, that is over the last 40 years, mass incarceration problem. Both of those problems are badly concentrated by race and by class. Here's the familiar race diagram. Notice that a black high school dropout is more likely than not to go to prison over a lifetime. The good news is over the last 20 years, incarceration's been falling. Crime has been falling very dramatically. Bad news is that until about 2006, incarceration was still growing. Now there's some lag there. The number of new prisoners peaked in about 2006. So we're likely to see some decline. But notice that if we got to the governor's goal of reducing incarceration by 25%, that would still leave us at about 4 times the rate of any country to which we'd like to compare ourselves. So we've got a serious problem of letting people out of prison who are not obviously harmless if we want to keep the crime rate down. And the only way to do that is, while keeping the crime rate down, is to let people out and supervise them in a way that reduces the risk they pose to other people. Our current practices of letting people out of prison and jail are notoriously unsuccessful. These are numbers for people released in 2005, but notice it's a 5-year follow-up, so we couldn't do much better than that. And these numbers have not improved over time. They're a little worse on paper than they are in typical practice because the very high recidivism rates are dominated by a limited number of people who keep going back again and again and again. It's the old Elizabeth Taylor problem in divorce rates. But even if you look at somebody who's gone to prison for the first time, the probability that he's back within 5 years is about 40%. That's not really a very attractive score. Of course, prison and jail, astonishingly expensive compared to anything else we do. And that raises the question about whether there are people who need more resources and more control than we can provide on probation or parole, but not as much as we provide a typical prisoner. And I say, is it possible to keep somebody out of trouble without paying his room and board bill? We do have an alternative to incarceration in this country. There are a lot more people with felony convictions on probation than there are in prison or in jail, but it's not a very successful system because it uses the wrong principles. Typical probationer has about 60 conditions to keep. Many of them are just routine boilerplate that judges add to all probation sentences. Think about the cognitive demands of keeping 60 different sets of rules. In general, we don't know very much about whether those rules are being kept. And even when we detect a violation, the probation officers are way too busy to write up every violation for the judge, so most violations go unpunished. But occasionally, after somebody accumulates 5 or 6 or 12 violations, you're back in court and the person's going to prison for 6 months. In addition, probation mandates lots of services. Not all of those services are welcome and not all of them are needed. And this is really a topic for another day. We vastly overuse financial penalties. Financial penalties are a great way to punish people with resources. But if you take somebody who's been committing crimes partly because he's poor and take money away from him, you're making things worse rather than better. There's a different way to do things, which is you have a small set of rules. You tell people exactly what they are. You make sure you know whether those rules are being complied with. And you guarantee that every violation has an unwanted consequence from the point of view of the offender. Simply the application of the principles of parenting to the probation system. If the probation system were a parent, we would call it both neglectful and abusive when we take the kid away. Too much misbehavior goes unsanctioned, and an occasional instance draws an excessively severe sanction. So that comports with none of the things we know about how to actually change human behavior. More recently, over the last 10 years more or less, there have been a series of programs that work on a different set of principles, which we've started to call swift, certain, and fair. And for that discussion, let me turn it over to the person who knows most about that, Angela Hawken from Pepperdine. Angela, take it away.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to brief you today. What I'll do is start by talking a little bit about the HOPE program that started in Hawaii, and then talk a little bit about how these principles of swiftness, certainty, and fairness have expanded across the country. So the HOPE program in Hawaii was launched by a judge who was really frustrated by the observation that probation officers would bring to him in his courtroom probationers who had long lists of violations, and were bringing them to his court for a revocation. And it was not untypical to see a probationer being brought into court who had 16 positive tests for methamphetamine, which is the drug of choice in Hawaii, 16 positive tests with no action taken up until then, because the only opportunities available to the probation officer at the time was to either continue to cajole, to talk with, to encourage the probationer, or on the other side, to initiate proceedings to revoke probation. In Hawaii, if a probationer was revoked, they would face really draconian underlying sentences. It was very typical to see 5, 10, sometimes 20 years. Now, in the face of a very stiff sentence, typically the probation officers were very reluctant to trigger a revocation. And so the only alternative was to let the violating behavior continue. So the model was based on a model of credible threats. The original judge in Hawaii, Judge Stephen Alm, developed what he called a motion to modify probation, which allowed the courts there the opportunity to issue a modest sanction in response to violating behavior, which gave the probation officer an expanded set of opportunities for managing negative behavior. The model that he designed was based on credible threats. Essentially, the rules and conditions of probation are now closely monitored and actually enforced. In Hawaii, they retained the original conditions of probation. Mark just mentioned how that's often a really long list. In most jurisdictions we work with now, we really encourage them to rationalize the list of probation conditions so that probationers really understand the rules of the game and what they're being asked to do. But the rules, it was very different for probationers in Hawaii once this HOPE program was introduced, because historically the courts had told them that they have to comply, and if they don't comply, something would happen. But they had learned very quickly that failure to comply was mostly left unchecked. Our data from Hawaii showed that if somebody was being supervised under routine probation, they had to have 7 violations on the record for there to be a 10% probability of any action being taken. In other words, you had to rack up a really long string of violating behavior before there was any response. The model in Hawaii, an individual is introduced into the program formally through open court, and the opening sentence of the judge, and this is true in most HOPE courts across the country now, the opening sentence of that judge is, "Everybody in this courtroom wants you to succeed." Typically, those warning hearings happen en masse. Usually between 8 and 10 probationers are warned into the program at the same time. And why we like that, we like the idea of mass hearings, is that every probationer can recognize that everybody who is supervised under this approach is treated equivalently. It doesn't matter their race, ethnicity, it doesn't matter what their priors have been. At that point, their outcomes under probation are entirely dependent on their own behavior while on probation. The rules are very, very clearly laid out. They're reinforced by the judge. They're then again reinforced by the probation officer. In the Hawaii version of the model, anybody who has a history of drug use, now these are typically heavily involved drug-using individuals. They certainly were in our studies of Hawaii. Any individual who has a history of drug use is subjected to regular random drug testing for the first few months of the program. And how it begins is they are randomly tested 6 times a month. If they test negative, they ratchet back, so they have to come in for less frequent drug testing. And after about 6 months, if they are able to demonstrate a series of negative drug tests, they are ultimately stepped off of the hotline completely. Every detected violation, that's failure to appear for a drug test, failure to appear for an office visit, testing positive for an illicit substance, is immediately responded to with an arrest, and the individual is brought before the court for a sanction. But the sanctions are modest. They typically involve 2 days in custody. In some of the Hope courts or swift, certain, fair courts that are now emerging across the country, they don't even always require incarcerating sanctions. We have some judges who will use 5 hours, a 5-hour detention, or something else, some alternative to incarceration. But every misstep that is detected has some sanction imposed. But what's very different about this sort of approach than other models we see is that in this model, not everybody who is screened as having a high on the ASI or having a history of drug use is mandated to drug treatment. The individual, through his own behavior, dictates both his supervision experience as well as his drug treatment experience. So that means if someone's doing well on supervision, very quickly the system steps back and gives the individual more freedom. They have to report less often, they're subjected to fewer requirements. If the individual demonstrates through his behavior or her behavior that they're struggling to succeed in the community, the system leans in. Supervision conditions ratchet up, and they'll increase the frequency of drug testing. If someone is able to abstain from drug use on their own, they are not mandated to drug treatment. But if they demonstrate through their own behavior that they are not able to desist from drug use, then they are mandated to drug treatment, and the court will continue to oversee that treatment experience. Now, when that court-mandated referral occurs depends on the individual and the nature of their drug use. Typically, the courts will use 3 positive drug tests in relatively short order as the indicator of treatment need. At any point in their supervision experience, an individual is able to ask and will receive substance abuse treatment services. Indeed, the sizable share of the allocation made for funding to Hope courts is dedicated to substance abuse treatment services. But the difference between some models you might be familiar with is that it's really the individual and their behavior that's dictating that treatment experience. We launched a randomized controlled trial of Hope in Hawaii in 2007. At that point, the program, which had been launched in 2004, was already 3 years old. It already had a great deal of street credibility. It had earned a reputation. So by the time we had randomized individuals into the Hope condition, most of the probationers had some good sense of what the model meant. This is important because our trial, we were able to show relatively good outcomes in that trial, but we have to recognize that that was in a context of an already mature Hope court that had an established reputation. What we find at sites across the country now, as these sites launch, is that sometimes it takes those jurisdictions 6 months or even up to a year to earn that reputation of having a credible system. Probationers are so used to courts dictating rules but not following through that they really have to earn back their credibility for this approach to work. The 1-year follow-up outcomes in Hawaii were surprisingly good. At the 1-year follow-up point, there was a dramatic reduction, and you can see the outcomes in your slides, a dramatic reduction in how likely people were to show up for their probation appointments. There was a big reduction in positive drug tests. They were half as likely to be revoked and returned to prison. And this is in the context of an intent to treat trial. Anybody assigned to Hope was counted in the Hope group, even individuals who had been on abscon status and never even showed up for their warning hearing. The Attorney General in Hawaii reports a revocation rate of 2% compared with our 7%, because they discount people who had appeared for their initial orientation into the Hope program. But very importantly, and I think one of the reasons why the model has gained attention in states now, in several states, is because of the reduction in the number of days incarcerated. We found very little difference in the use of jails following the implementation of the model. In fact, the jail savings were really quite modest. About 2 days, on average, about 2 days fewer jail days were served for the Hope group compared with the control group, the individuals who were supervised under routine probation. Essentially what was happening is that many people could have these 2-day short sanctions under Hope for every individual who every now and again would be sent to jail, but for much longer stretches of time, typically 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. We've just completed a 7-year follow-up evaluation of that original randomized control trial. A very fair question to ask following that initial work was, well, would the reductions in drug use that were observed during that first year persist when people had had a much longer experience or had completed probation? There's a great deal of drug treatment literature that shows that the treatment effect is primarily during the active phase of treatment, and often that differential shrinks after the person leaves care. Well, we were interested to see if that similar phenomenon was true for Hope individuals under Hope. Now, important to point out here is probationary terms in Hawaii are really quite long. We see 4 or 5 years of probation are quite typical, so that if you are under probation in Hawaii, you have a relatively long period where your drug use is being managed through the court. So it's a long enough period in many circumstances to develop a new set of habits. The long-term follow-up demonstrated that even at 7 years out, those individuals who had been originally assigned to the Hope Court had 50% fewer follow-up convictions for drug charges. So it did indicate that the reduction in drug use persisted over the longer term. We also found that only half as many were revoked and returned to prison at 7-year follow-up. A very important finding, and if you're able to look in the handouts, and I hope you have it in front of you, is a little bar chart. It looks something like this. Now, I like to refer to this, I call this phenomenon behavioral triage, because what it does show to us is that when individuals are subjected to the right set of circumstances, many people, even people who are regarded as heavy drug users, are able to desist from drug use on their own. What you'll notice, and to be in this study, individuals have had to have had a high score on the ASI. They also have had to have demonstrated recent histories of non-compliance through positive drug tests. So to be in the study, they had to have had recent positives on the books with probation. Half of those people never tested positive, not even one time during the 1-year follow-up period. Now, just as a reminder, they were tested 6 times a month to begin with, and then they were stepping down. And at the time the study was done, they would have been on that 6 times a month frequency for 3 months. So if individuals were, and then stepped down to 4, and then to 3, and then to 2. So if somebody was using in this approach, it's that window of detection would have certainly allowed them to detect that drug use. So about half of them were able to desist from drug use on their own. Just over a quarter of them tested positive only one time. And what you can see is the really important distribution on the right, part of the distribution on the right-hand side. Those who tested positive 3 or more times during the 1-year follow-up period. So of this group of really problematic probationers who were considered at high risk of being revoked from probation, only 9% of them tested positive 3 or more times during that 1-year follow-up period. What this model has become is a triage tool for deciding who gets treatment. Now, what I noted is when the Hawaii legislature makes appropriations for this model, most of that funding gets allocated towards drug treatment, but how they manage their drug treatment resources is now quite different in the state. They allow individuals to behaviorally triage themselves into demonstrating through their own behavior that they cannot desist from drug use, even in the face of a known credible threat. A jail sanction is certainly a credible threat of something negative happening. If someone cannot stop drug use in the face of that known threat, they've clearly indicated their problem use, and at that point, the Hawaiian system is able to invest a substantial amount in their care. So what we see is much better quality care being provided for a smaller percentage of the population, the percentage of the population that is demonstrated that they need intensive substance abuse treatment resources. The other feature of the model, of course, is that individuals are able to, at any time, request drug treatment for themselves. And we find only a very small percentage of them do that. But anybody who indicates a need for care through their own experience, their own will, is automatically provided that care. There's been a number of important innovations to that original program that was launched in Hawaii. I think one of the more important lessons we've learned is that when it comes to punishment, less is more. That the Secretary of Corrections from Washington State, Secretary Bernard Warner, is increasingly, where this is now statewide, increasingly refers to what he says as the power of sanctions. And by the power of sanctions, he doesn't mean we should be doing more of them. He's implying that they are so powerful that we really have to understand that we should be doing less of them rather than more of them. What we're also seeing in terms of innovation is non-incarcerating responses. Our goal is essentially to find the smallest amount of punishment that brings about the desired behavior change. Ohio is the state to watch in this regard. We've just launched swift, certain, fair programs in 3 counties in Ohio, and none of those counties use incarceration for responding to technical violations. If the behavioral effect holds in Ohio, that'll have striking implications for community corrections across the country. We're also starting to see innovations being introduced in terms of behavioral shaping modifications on the reward side. Judge Alm in Hawaii now, at the time of orienting somebody into the program, will let them know that if they're able to demonstrate compliance with the terms of supervision, that he'll allow for an early discharge from probation. Now in Hawaii, where the typical term is 5 years, they're able to shave up to 3 years off of that sentence. In other words, he's reducing their sentences by up to 60% if they're able to demonstrate compliance. And for many individuals, that turns out to be quite motivating. 5 years seems insurmountable. 2 years they can wrap their heads around. Now, as part of our follow-up study, we tracked every single individual that was given an early discharge through the Hope Court. There were over 100 cases that we had analyzed as part of that work. Not a single one of those cases had run into any follow-up problems with the law in the follow-up period. In other words, there was also a triage effect, that individuals who are able to show through their behavior that they can comply with behavior are a really good bet to step back from. There were no negative public safety consequences from allowing those individuals to resume their liberty. We're also starting to see in custody applications of these principles, and I'll talk a little bit about the findings from the first 2 states have implemented swift, certain, fair in custody. The swift, certain, fair programs, we like the language of swift, certain, fair rather than a particular model like Hope, probation, because this really is a set of principles rather than a brand. And we've seen many different sorts of implementations of these principles in jurisdictions now across the country that are moving to speed up the processes in their system, to make sure that individuals are all treated equivalently within the system, and that the sanction responses given the misstep are fair. We often find it's really useful to discourage judges from revoking just because they're mad, which is often what happens, particularly for drug-involved individuals. Judges see them frequently. They cycle in front of their courts, and even if they don't necessarily face even if there's not necessarily a public safety risk, you often see the revocation to court. Under the swift, certain, fair model, judges have to think very carefully about their revocation decisions, and we find surprisingly few individuals ultimately are revoked, except if there's a reasonable public safety concern. So the first movers in really adopting a very high fidelity version of this model really was Judge Arm in Hawaii, but several states started implementing similar programs almost simultaneously. In the exact month in 2004 that Judge Arm launched Hope in Hawaii, a probation director, Leighton Isles, had launched almost exactly the equivalent program in Fort Bend, Texas. So this was really the Hope-like model, but there was the inspiration of a probation chief rather than a judge. That model that was evaluated by universities by professors at a university in Texas had very similar outcomes findings to what we found for Hope in Hawaii. The RAND Corporation started working in South Dakota on a program called South Dakota 24/7. This is a version of swift, certain, fair principles as applied to repeat DUI offenders. And the idea is that there's regular testing. Twice a day, individuals have to come in either on SCRAM, which is active monitoring, or they blow twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, to demonstrate that they are not falling back into problem drinking. The results of the RAND Corporation look stunningly like the results of our own work from Hawaii. And if you remember this behavioral triage curve that I showed you earlier, we are now working in several states, over a dozen states across the country. This behavioral triage curve from the RAND Corporation looks almost exactly the same as it does for our probationers the aim is to get them to desist from illicit drug use. So the alcohol desistance curve and the drug use desistance curve looks almost identical. This drug desistance curve also looks almost identical whether you're in Hawaii or Texas or Massachusetts or Arkansas or Washington State. This tends to be how individuals behave from state to state when they're subjected to a credible model. There are now programs in over 28 states in the country applying the principles of swift, certain, and fair. And there are 2 statewide implementations. Washington State in 2004, at a time that was really, it was almost a time of crisis for that state. The legislature was threatening to completely remove community corrections except for the supervision of drug offenders. Well, that gave an opportunity for change where community corrections officers throughout the system were open to a radical transformation where they might not otherwise have been so open-minded. Potentially losing your job can get someone's attention. Well, at that time, they rolled the program out as statewide, promising the legislature that they would enjoy substantial cuts in incarceration as a result of the model. The legislature said, well, if you mean it, if you really believe this is going to reduce incarceration, we're going to take away a sizable chunk of your budget. they removed $40 million from Bernie Warner's budget and reinvested $6 million in treatment services as part of that. Well, fortunately for Bernie Warner and the people of Washington State, those jail savings really were realized. There were substantial reductions in what's called the average daily violator population. That's the number of people in counties throughout the state that are serving time because of days in custody due to technical violations. Alaska is now also moving in the direction of statewide, and we have several other states now with a number of courts that are picking up this model. There's so many courts are being introduced to the model now that it looks as though in relatively short order those will be moving in the state direction also. The federal government has really had an active role in learning more about this model and continues to do this, as well as disseminating some of the lessons learned. And important among those lessons is when not to do this, not only when to do this. The federal government, through the National Institute of Justice and the Bureau of Justice Assistance, funded what's referred to as the National Demonstration Field Experiment. And that's an experiment that's underway in 4 states now. It's Arkansas, Massachusetts, Texas, and Oregon. That'll really be the definitive study of how this approach works in multiple jurisdictions, and that's overseen by Pam Lattimore at RTI, who's a phenomenal researcher, one of our country's top criminal justice researchers. The Department of Justice has also just funded a second round, 6 states and 1 tribal court. We've seen the first tribal court implementation that has really important consequences for that tribe. The tribe went in the direction of extremely draconian drug laws. They had a sizable share of their populations died due to heroin overdoses in the past several years, and as a result, their statutes have become very, very draconian in responding to drug use. A sizable share of their youthful population have been banished from the tribe. They've been removed from their tribal identity, which is a true tragedy for the individuals living on that reservation, having lost their family members. Through putting the new tribal court in place, they are now able to provide much more modest responses to drug use and provide those treatment services rather than the very severe responses of having those individuals removed. Round 3 is about to be announced. Round 3 is the next set of states that the federal government has supported in their implementations of Swift, Certain, Fair. And at the same time, the Department of Justice has just supported the Swift, Certain, Fair Resource Center. 2 states decided that 2 states were having challenges in custody, and this is true, I think, for most states, and thought that they would like to experiment or at least pilot the ideas of introducing swiftness, certainty, and fairness in their in-custody population. So these are 2 states who are experimenting with Swift, Certain, Fair within their prisons. Washington State and Ohio are the first 2 states to have Swift, Certain, Fair in prison, and there are now early indications of a few other states that will be moving in that direction also. Washington was trying to use Swift, Certain, and Fair as an alternative to removing good time. A sizable share of their inmates lost their good time, which really ultimately ended up extending their prison stays. Since implementing the Swift, Certain, Fair approach in January 2014, second quarter of 2014, they were able to demonstrate a 60% reduction in the number of days of good time that's been removed from their inmate population. That'll have serious consequences for the state's prison budget down the line. Ohio implemented, yes.
So how does that work in Washington? How do they implement Swift, Certain, Fair in their prisons?
They actually, the initial impetus, I think the reductions of losses of good time was a happy accident. Initially, Washington implemented the principles of Swift, Certain, Fair to reduce the use of administrative segregations. Washington has been a really progressive state in trying to reduce the use of isolation. So how they did this is, instead of allowing incidents to escalate, they put everybody on notice that any small misstep in custody, and they were particularly going to focus on violence, but even small things, if individuals were starting to get out of line, that they would have a small sanction imposed, but it would be immediately. And what they did do is they tried to determine what was salient to the inmates. And it's true that often when we design sanctions, we don't pay attention to the customer or the person whose behavior we're trying to transform. They did that. They paid attention to their inmates to learn, well, what did they feel would motivate them to behave in an improved way. So the inmates really, understanding their inmates led to a list of responses to negative behavior that they're able to use. And an example of one that's turned out to be astonishingly effective is the removal of personal tennis shoes. Now, for those of you who are familiar with prisons, there are very few liberties allowed within the confinements of a prison, and any way to individually identify yourself is a pretty big deal. Well, in Washington State, if you've had a relatively good history of behavior, you're allowed to have personal sneakers, and personal sneakers are, it's their cars in custody. Losing their personal sneakers for 2 weeks is something that's immediate and it's salient. It resonates with them, and they want their sneakers back. So this is an example of these really modest, we would think of as really modest sanctions, but they have a lot of legs in that these are things people who are there in the confines of their custody experience really care about. So these sorts of responses were used, and they managed to reduce the use of administrative segregation. I think the last time I looked at their data, it was down 26% following the implementation of Swift, Certain, Fair, as well as reducing reductions of good time by 60%. Ohio's just finished, I just recently had a check-in with the prison in Ohio. They've implemented Swift, Certain, Fair to begin in one of their prisons. They showed also substantial reductions in the use of administrative segregation, and that's been so successful in the prison that initially launched that model that it's now been spread to other prisons across the state. I'm going to hand over to Mark, who's going to talk a little bit more about what we think is the next step in the application of swiftness, certainty, and fairness as it applies to what we call graduated reentry. I look like I have a hand.
Yeah, we have a few questions, I guess, before.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Do you know which counties in Ohio are introducing Swiss certificate?
It's I know the prison. It's Belmont, and I can put you in touch. The warden of the prison is Michelle Miller. I can give you more information about that. Actually, I have an initial first report. She's working with me with the state on her first report now, and can share, if with her permission, can share her early findings, which has now been documented.
Similar question in Ohio. So you mentioned they're the state to watch for non-incarceration-based sanctions. What are they doing that's non-incarceration?
Right. So there's actually, they are. So the initial plan was to, unfortunately for Ohio, they've actually been quite creative, but their initial plan, because they were funded by the federal government, it turned out that they had no choice but to not use incarceration. The federal government refuses to fund any site that has what are called pay-to-stay jails. A pay-to-stay jail is where you have the opportunity to, through private funds, improve your prison experience. In other words, you can have a nicer prison experience if someone pays to give you a pay-for-stay, so your living circumstances are nicer. The federal government is very much opposed to pay-for-stay, so they would not allow Ohio to implement the HOPE model with federal funding if they use their local jails, because their local jails are almost all pay-for-stay. So instead, they had to scramble for an alternative solution. It also just recently has taken community supervision off the table, unfortunately, because they were actually really well able to use community supervision because they could implement it that day. Very few states are able to configure community supervision to kick in so quickly. And in a swift and certain sanctions model, you want the sanction to be immediate. But in Ohio, the community supervision is also overseen by the local jails, and they are pay for stay, so no, they weren't allowed to be involved. So instead what they're doing is using electronic monitoring. So the person is immediately subjected to home confinement, electronic monitoring. They are only able to go to work. Everybody is trying to protect work through. This is true of all of the HOPE courts. If somebody is holding a paycheck job, the sanctions will typically be on the weekend, or they'll work around work schedules. So the one site is using electronic monitoring. The other site is using an in-community program, which is really quite nice, because if somebody has this, and there's basically a curriculum designed, it's a 2-day curriculum that's designed to try to improve the behavior of the individuals who are misstepping. If the person is, and they also have a problem with opiate use in that jurisdiction, if the person is testing positive for heroin or an opiate, they'll keep them for 5 days. They are differentiating between the types of positive drug tests now. And the concern there was that they really thought they needed a longer period of time to really work with the heroin users in that jurisdiction. So we're seeing some kind of, it's not a lockdown facility, but it's a residential facility in the community, and we're seeing the electronic monitoring. And we'll know, they've moved along quite quickly. My expectation is we'll have some early indications of how this is going by the end of this year already. And as I said, if we can see that the behavioral response using these sorts of alternatives is similar to what we found when the judges were using jail sanctions instead. It'll just be the tip of the iceberg. I'm assuming that very quickly we're going to see jurisdictions willing to experiment with other sorts of responses also. I think the initial concern was that Judge Alm in Hawaii had used jail sanctions, and there had been some demonstrated success with jail sanctions. Many other jurisdictions, and we've seen evaluations from sites across the country now, had some, they demonstrated success with jail sanctions. But the approach was really new. There really wasn't a science to say this has to be a jail sanction, and there still isn't. We're going to learn. But I think what's really helped very quickly, especially given the umbrella of swiftness, certainty, and fairness rather than a branded model, is that jurisdictions have felt comfortable to innovate, to learn what really works well in their own jurisdictions. And I think we're only beginning to see that now. So that very, very soon, I think a year from now, we're going to know much more about sanctioning and what we can use as alternatives to custody.
Is there questions? On the phone? Any questions on the phone?
No.
All right. All right, Mark.
Okay, thank you. Let me just follow up on that last question. One very potent sanction is curfew. And we discovered that in Washington State in the little randomized controlled trial we ran on parole before they went statewide with it. There was somebody who committed a fairly serious infraction, something he could have been prosecuted for, but it was decided to handle it through the Swift and Fair Sanction System instead. And so the hearing officer imposed Angela, correct me if this is wrong, but as I recall, he imposed 2 weeks confinement, which was the maximum. And the offender was perfectly okay with that, more or less what had been expected. And then the judge said, in a month of a 7 p.m. curfew to follow, the guy almost broke down in tears. That was a really, really tough sanction as far as he was concerned. Now we have not pursued this, but one way to think about it is that if you're in jail, you're in jail. You're comparing yourself with other people in jail. You're not doing so badly. If you're in the community but on a tight curfew, you have to go home from the party early, and you're comparing yourself with other free people. One way or another, that turned out to be a very powerful sanction. The other thing is that in Washington State, in their statewide system, the first sanction is what's called a stipulated agreement, which in most cases is simply an admission of wrongdoing and an acknowledgement that there'll be a sanction for the next one. And the compliance curve looks just the same. So Angela pointed out that the compliance curves look the same regardless of jurisdiction and regardless of offender type. They appear to look just the same regardless of what the intensity of the original sanction is. So whatever the minimum sanction is, we haven't found it yet. But I think we're going to keep looking. So
Sure, I should have mentioned, sorry, I marked us on that. I think it's really interesting. In Washington State, they're only supervised, their caseload is almost entirely high risk. Essentially, it's a mix of, Washington has a very strange system, so it's essentially a mix of probationers and parolees. But following some legislative reforms, they really have a very, very high-risk caseload. The new evaluation, which is forthcoming from Washington State University, researchers at Washington State University, and the department has been briefing this, so I'm able to share some of these results, shows that half of that high-risk supervision caseload is violation-free under their new Swift, Certain, Fair model. So only half of them have picked up even a single violation, and that it's under 20% have gone on to have the 5 or more violating processes. Under Washington law, even for the high-risk individuals, if they violate, the law allows them to serve up to 3 days in custody. Now before, if someone had picked up a violation pending a hearing, they were staying in custody on average at least 3 weeks before even seeing a hearings officer. So you can see how dramatically that would have cut the jail stays. I mean, just getting the system to move so much more quickly has really reduced the number of days of custody. The Washington State study, which again I think is forthcoming hopefully within the next month or so, was funded by the Arnold Foundation. We've seen some of the cost-benefit results from that study. And the number that was most recently reported by Secretary Warner was that the Washington State University has found that $4 was saved for every dollar invested in their Swift and Certain program. It was certainly a lean operation, what they had managed to do in Washington. Go ahead, Mark, sorry.
So, the Washington crew that we originally looked at were recent parolees, a lot of heroin use. As I recall, for about 1/3 of them, the registered address with the parole office was homeless. And we got very good results. The parolees on the program did a lot better than the parolees on parole as usual. Well, parolees look a lot like prisoners. So that raises the question whether we can start taking people who are currently in prison and putting them out on this sort of tight supervision. If we think about the current process of releasing somebody from prison, it looks like it must have been designed by a bunch of crazy people. We take somebody that we have fed, clothed, housed, and provided medical care for a period of years, and ordered around 24 hours a day, who hasn't either had to manage himself or take care of himself over that period, who, if he's been in long enough, probably doesn't know how to use a smartphone, doesn't have a driver's license, doesn't have a Medicaid card, and the first night out isn't eligible for homeless shelter services because he was housed the night before. So unless he has a family to go back to, he may very well spend his first night of freedom under a bridge. We take that person, we give him $40 in a suit and say, good luck. It's not very surprising we get bad results. So the other thing we know from lots of studies is that if you measure stress, and you can do this either by interviewing or using physiological measures like cortisol, you measure stress among prisoners, it peaks at 2 points in the sentence, at the beginning and the end. The guards call it gate fever. Inmates are terrified about going home. They're not happy about staying in, but they're afraid of going home, and for good reason. If you look at people just released from prison, say the month out of prison, and look at their mortality rate compared to people of the same demographic from the same neighborhood, their mortality is 12 times backward. Homicide, suicide, overdose, heart attack, stroke. And we get those 60% recidivism numbers. So what would a reentry process look like that decreased the suddenness with which somebody goes from complete confinement and being taken care of to complete freedom and having to take care of himself? Well, we could let him out of a cell and put him in an efficiency apartment, so the housing problem is taken care of. And we could make that apartment legally a cell. So he doesn't leave it unless he's allowed to. He doesn't have visitors unless he's allowed to. He's legally a prisoner, so he can be returned quickly if he gets out of line, subject to drug testing, subject to a curfew, that is, say he's only allowed to be out at certain hours, not allowed visitors early on, not allowed the use of money. He's got an EBT card he can spend for limited purchases at a limited number of merchants, which makes it harder to buy a gun or to buy drugs. And he's given both hope and incentive to find work. And every time he does what he's supposed to do, he gets a little bit freer. So he might start out on a 6 p.m. curfew, and after a week, his graduated reentry officer, his corrections officer, will say to him, well, you've done what you're supposed to do this week. You're now on a 6:30 curfew. Congratulations. The principle is that freedom is the reward for good behavior and for accomplishment. If he gets a job, then he gets lots of privileges. There's a program in Montgomery County, Maryland called the Montgomery County Pre-Release Center, which is a work-oriented halfway house. They claim about a 96% success rate in getting their felony prison releasees jobs. Whether we can do that well or not, I don't think we know yet. But that would be the goal. And some of you will be saying, well, look, this sounds a lot like a halfway house, doesn't it? Answer, yes. Halfway houses are expensive, not compared to prison, but compared to anything else. They're hard to cite, and they're hard to manage. Most halfway houses are not public agencies, they're nonprofits, and those contracts are not necessarily very well enforced in terms of getting the manager of the halfway houses to do the right thing. But the main problem with halfway houses is citing one. The community's not generally very happy about having a halfway house. So the graduated reentry idea, or as John likes to call it, earned graduated reentry, would start in the prison. Say, look, if you'd like to be on this program of getting out early, you have to behave well in prison, and then the people who qualify for that get out onto this fairly tight program. But the housing is scattered site. You simply find routine housing, either Section 8 or market rate, that poor people can afford, and you rent that person a unit. If you think about the current mix, we have a lot of community corrections, which is generally pretty loose. We have a tiny amount of halfway house, and then we have about a little less than a third of the people under correctional supervision are actually behind bars. What we're proposing is to take a substantial fraction of those people behind bars and put them out, put them on graduated reentry, and take a substantial chunk of the community corrections population and put it under swift, certain, fair sanctioning. That could happen one of two ways, or both. One version would be, okay, you committed your first adult felony, you stole somebody's car, you broke a shop window and stole some stuff, you're put on probation, and the probation officers as well. What you did was something we don't want you doing. And to remind you of that, here are the conditions you're under for the first 6 weeks. Intensive drug testing, curfew, and so on. But here's the good news. If you comply with those conditions for the first 6 weeks, then we will step you down to routine probation, which isn't very much supervision. And on the other hand, if you screw up in those first 6 weeks, then you're going to spend a substantial period on swift, certain, fair until you demonstrate that you don't need it anymore. And on the other side of the equation, if you're on routine probation and foul up, the first response to that is to put you on a swift, certain, fair program. So that at every step, the principle is to give somebody as much supervision as he needs and no more. And any services he shows he needs or wants, and no more than that. Stop using services as a sanction. How well will this work? Can we actually get back to a civilized incarceration rate? I don't think we're going to know until we've tried. But I don't see any plausible way of getting to the 25% target, let alone the more aggressive target that I think we ought to have, unless we start revising the process by which we let people out of prison. And while a standard swift, certain, fair program is an intensification of supervision under community corrections, costs somewhat more money, though not grossly more money, and makes the person somewhat less free, somewhat more supervised. Starting with somebody in prison, or somebody who would be in prison, and putting that person on a graduated reentry program, starts with a savings in cost and a gain in liberty. And that seems to me like an attractive direction to go in. It's possible that the first example of this nationally will be in Illinois. Winnebago County has indicated their strong interest, and now we're just trying to find a foundation that wants to pay for the pilot program. That would be for people being held pre-trial on felony charges. In Winnebago, they spend about 300 days behind bars before they actually come to trial. So that would be a long period to see if we could work within the community. We might get a bonus that some of them would have established a sufficiently good work record awaiting trial to persuade the judge not to send them away once the plea or conviction to happen. The other two opportunities we have at the moment are both in New Jersey. New Jersey parole is going to try to use this, or intends to try to use this, instead of revocation. So somebody would be otherwise facing a revocation back to prison for technical parole violations. Instead will face a revocation to graduated reentry program. They also have something called intensively supervised probation. Again, people being let out of prison early onto tight community supervision, but not swift, certain, fair sanctioning. About half of those people wash out, not typically for new crimes, but for technical violations. We're talking to them about taking those washouts and instead of sending them back to prison, put them in an apartment and see if they can make it under that sort of supervision. There's no way to promise that this will work because we haven't tried it yet. But that seems to me like a direction we ought to be going in, and I'm encouraged by how much willingness we found in jurisdictions to at least think about trying this out. That's our story, and we're sticking to it. And now to your questions.
Did you hear that, Mark or Angela?
No, I missed it.
In Winnebago County, the people are pre-trial. What happens with the charges against them are dropped?
I'm sorry, John, could you repeat the question? I missed it.
In Winnebago, what would happen for the pretrial if the charges were dropped?
If the charges were dropped, presumably there's no basis to hold the person. But apparently these are people who are actually eventually going to face trial.
How do you know that?
How do you know that?
That's what we're being told by the people in the county, that they do not hold a lot of people for a year and then just drop the charges. But we'd have to look.
Hi, I have a question about, two questions. One is, how do you monitor your curfew program? And I'm curious if there are electronic monitoring so you know that they violated, or how do you know they're home when they're supposed to be home? And the second thing is, what are the caseloads for people who are on the swift and certain sanctions model? Like, how many cases is an average agent or officer handling?
Sorry, I caught about every second word. I apologize. John, I'm hearing you better.
Yeah, I'll yell it out. So there's two questions. One was, how are you monitoring curfew? Or places that are doing curfew, how do you ensure that you're actually where you're supposed to be? And the other question was, what kind of caseloads are you seeing with swift, certain, fair? What's an average caseload look like?
Perhaps I can take this one, and Mark can follow up. The decision in Ohio to use electronic monitoring was instead of curfews. They initially had considered using curfews also, and what they had decided was that the supervision burden of enforcing that curfew was probably larger than the costs of just putting on an so they have an ankle device. So they actually moved away from using curfews and used the home monitoring instead. In Washington State, where they did use curfews, that was in the context of they have these community response units that are very actively involved in parts of the community where there are lots of high-risk individuals under supervision. They have a team that's really out there 24/7, and they use that community response unit to make sure that there were regular check-ins to enforce that curfew. But that in some jurisdictions where that sort of set of assets exists, that's a relatively good model. In other jurisdictions, it might not be feasible. For example, in the jurisdictions we're working with in Ohio, they decided to use electronic monitoring instead. The second question on caseloads. It really, we see it all over the map. In Washington State, when we first launched a tiny pilot, it was a proof of concept study for high-risk parolees. At that point, the caseload was 35 to 40 people per supervising officer. We see caseloads of up to 190. It really depends on the jurisdiction, because jurisdictions vary substantially in terms of what the job description of the supervising officer is. In some jurisdictions, the POs parole officer or the probation officer is responsible for going out, for serving the law enforcement function. Sometimes they have to do their own drug testing. So it very much depends on what job descriptions fall on the probation officer. In jurisdictions where they don't have to do the law enforcement function as much, or they don't have to oversee, these are all overseen drug tests, they have larger caseloads. In sites where the job is more intensive, they have smaller caseloads. But anything from 40 to 180 is what we see in the field at the moment.
Hawaii did not change caseload when it went to swift, certain, fair, and there was certainly a bulge in workload at the beginning during the period of the high violation rate, and then it settled down. The main impact on probation officer workload in Hawaii was that before swift, certain, fair, the no-show rate for a monthly probation meeting was about 10%. So a probation officer could pretty well count on at least one no-show per day, which would allow time to get paperwork done. And swift, certain, fair took away that slack time because everybody showed up for their appointments. Other than that, there was not very much impact, and you reduced the impact of having to write up lengthy violation reports because the judge streamlined violation reporting for the swift, certain, fair sanctions, which would be a couple of days, compared to the lengthy document required if you were looking at a probation revocation. On the graduated reentry idea, if you got somebody in an apartment and it has a webcam over the front door and motion sensors on the windows, it's not possible to leave that unit without somebody knowing. That's an alternative to an ankle bracelet. Ross Halpern, who's I think on the phone now, has been doing a lot of research into the technology of position monitoring. It looks like the ankle bracelet is going to go the way of the hula hoop. After all, a cell phone plus a Fitbit gives you about the same capacity with a lot less discomfort. But if somebody's supposed to be home, then you can have a radio frequency monitor, which is relatively cheap, and an ankle bracelet. Or you can simply require somebody to be available by cell phone and take a picture of himself next to a fixed unit in the apartment so that the corrections officer knows that he's where he's supposed to be. That's something that has to be shaken down, but that's not one of the big nightmares, it seems to me. The real question is how many of these people can actually get jobs and hold them, and that remains to be seen. If they can get jobs and hold them, the program goes from being about cost neutral compared to prison to being close to free.
How is drug testing randomized in Hawaii?
There's a call-in hotline. So under their model, every weekday, at the time of being warned into the program, they're told that they'd be put on a color code hotline, and that same day their probation officer will assign them a color. And depending on where to begin with, obviously they have the highest level of frequency, so they're assigned a color that comes up, at least 6 times a month. And they also have a wild card, so that they take that and then they will add either 0, 1, or 2. So otherwise, if by random luck, they happen to have all 6 drug tests in the first 2 weeks of the month, they know that there's going to be no testing. Well, because of the wild card, they don't know what else is happening. So it'll actually always be kind of 6, 7, or 8 to begin. But it's purely random. We have sites set up across the country now that have hotlines, and they're vendors at very low cost will provide a hotline facility for probation departments.
Again, the mechanism is that the probationer calls in every day to find out whether it's his day to come in for a drug test. I guess now that you're using text messaging, Angela, we could think about substituting that for the call-in.
No, actually, we were thinking about that for one of our trials, and many of the providers who work with some of these clients were saying that they actually found some therapeutic value in that call-in. The person has to initiate the call, they have to remember to teach us some responsibility. We were thinking of just texting people to let them know, but I think it helped them keep their drug use in check, just knowing that they didn't know what was going to happen and having to make that call on their own. So we actually were under advisement to let them keep making that call. So anyway, but it still could be open for testing.
Right. One of the fascinating things about this business is you never know what's going to prove to be therapeutic.
A follow-up here.
Is the substance abuse treatment programming standardized throughout Hawaii, and if so, what form does it take?
No, and this is true for across the country. I mean, Hawaii is the one model we discussed, but this is now implemented in 28 states, and it really varies. We actually see, in Hawaii they do have some really good long-term residential providers for individuals who really demonstrate. Initially, they'll have the option of going residential or outpatient. If they aren't performing well in outpatient, then they'll be referred to one of the inpatient providers, and either it could be a 3-month provider or up to a 2-year provider in Hawaii, depending on what the demonstrated need is. But in some jurisdictions, it really is, the treatment side of this has become the biggest part of the challenge, is finding good quality treatment under the model of really by the time the person is indicated a problem drug use, you really want to make sure that they get into high quality care. And not all jurisdictions have that. Often might mean a resident, by the time a person has tested positive 3 times in this month in this model in relatively short order, depending on the nature of the drug use, it might indicate the need for residential care. And we're surprised still, in 2015, how we look across the country, how many jurisdictions are really hard pressed to find good quality residential providers. So that does continue to be a challenge for some of the states we work with. We encourage them early on to resolve that as one of their priority issues. So before we set up help facilitate a Swift Certain Phase site, we try to make sure that they really take stock of what treatment providers are around. The other thing we do, and this has been especially important, for example, in our work with Texas, one of the sites in Texas, there was a complete lack of confidence in the community-based treatment providers, and they had what they considered to be outstanding quality provider in custody, which for us was, our mission is to reduce incarceration while maintaining public safety, and having the judges, of course, well-meaning judges, trigger a custody stay because they wanted them to have 6 months of residential care was something that now we, having to work with that jurisdiction, and they're having to try to find, get contracting in place to get those sorts of beds. So that does continue to be, part of the challenge, is making sure that individuals who have demonstrated they're on the right-hand side of that curve are given the sort of treatment that really is appropriate given the needs. We're also increasingly working with the courts now for those who are supervising caseloads that have, where opiate use is an issue. We'll have our first site now where they'll also be, we're working with a doctor who's using Vivitrol for the opiate users. So it's going to be interesting to see how we're only beginning to learn about how these interactions are going to play out, having a court involved in the Vivitrol decision and as part of the treatment package. So I think we still all have to stay tuned and see how this all unfolds. But right now across the country, opiate use for many of our sites is continuing to be a challenge, and seeing how the courts are looking into medication-assisted treatment has been a challenge for many of the courts, and I think they've come a long way in terms of recognizing that they have to manage this population differently. And Ohio is a good example of that, where they now even differentiate the sanction for the opiate users because they were really concerned about them. It wasn't a decision made because they wanted to treat heroin in a more draconian way. It was a decision made out of true concern for the well-being of the individuals in that caseload.
And we still don't know as much as we'd like to. Sorry, was there a question?
Oh, I was going to say, this is primarily a question to Angela. Can you talk about some of the challenges of implementing Swift Certain Fair?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a sort of model where it's often described, because of Judge Alm in Hawaii, as a judge-centered model. And Judge Alm was the judge who is a really charismatic judge. He speaks well. People are drawn to him, who set up the Hope Court in Hawaii. So often we hear people talking about this judge model. It's a court-centered model. It really is not. Having a good judge who is able to engage offenders well is essential to the success of the program, or to a successful implementation. We'll leave the researchers to tell us if it's successful. But it's really essential that the supervising agency, so the community corrections piece, probation or parole, that whoever leads that shop interact really, really well with that court. And if you don't have an enthusiastic probation department, I usually discourage a site from starting. There's several players that you need to have on board. The judge, you really want an enthusiastic judge who can establish a positive rapport with his caseload. You want probation officers who are enthusiastic about the approach, and the leadership to really engage the court well, but also bring in the treatment providers. You have to have them willing to keep their data. This is much more data intensive than many other sorts of models. To know that you're doing something swiftly, with certainty, and with fairness means you have to have data that demonstrates whether you're meeting those objectives. So for many jurisdictions, even just getting the data piece right, or the willingness to get the data piece right, has been really essential. And then law enforcement. In Hawaii, for example, the probation officers do not have power of arrest. So in that case, if someone had failed to appear or was absconding, that's one potentially very weak link. If a person thinks they can get out of the hassle of having to behave by simply failing to report, that's a lesson that would be very badly taught, and you want to end that. They had the support of Hawaii PD. The U.S. Marshals would swoop in and serve those warrants. They had a very quick law enforcement response. Now, some jurisdictions can manage to do that. They can manage to establish those relationships to have that very quick response. But not all jurisdictions have that leadership. You really want a few champions who can say, well, I see our absconds are rising. We really need to bring in our law enforcement partners now. And also recognize that it really is a chain and that everybody has to be collaborating. Some jurisdictions do that really, really, really well, and they have those relationships in place already. Other jurisdictions really have to get those relationships in place. So it really depends on local circumstances, and then other things like, is it a well-resourced? It helps if they have drug treatment resources available. It helps if they have alternatives to custody, if that's something the site wants to do. One of the Ohio sites I failed to mention. I think I may have announced this in the next round. Of funding, we're very hopeful, I should say, that one of the sites in Ohio that will be funded is instead of so the one site has electronic monitoring, the other site uses that community-based provider, but the other site has a day reporting center. So rather than custody, they'll be going to the day reporting center. We'll have some very neatly outlined sets of curriculum that individuals will have to do, whether it's working on job readiness or whatever it is. So they're using whatever resources they have to make this work. What we try to do with jurisdictions when we're setting up a new model like this is to be respectful of the local players. It's a very bad idea to take a group of individuals who often are doing things that are very good. They might be following some very good practices, and to crush their enthusiasm and to crush everything that they're doing that's going well with this new model and very specific instructions of what to do. What we try to do instead is find out what are the strengths of the local jurisdiction, and how can we weave in the principles of swiftness, certainty, and fairness into what they're already doing. And I think that approach of saying, well, let's figure out where your weaknesses are. Can we find ways to fill those gaps? But let's also really make sure we aren't disrespectful of your successes. That approach tends to resonate with probation departments, which across the country are already doing some really amazing things. So the idea is to never kill something successful, but to add to what they're already doing.
Can I also ask, so this is, for offenders who have a drug issue, seems really, but what if your criminal behavior had nothing to do with drugs or alcohol?
Same conditions. If you're a sex offender in Hawaii, on Oahu, you're now automatically supervised in the HOPE model. And all the conditions, again, set of conditions, and they're closely monitored. If you fail to appear for your sex offender treatment, if you fail to appear for your polygraph, if you make contact with someone you're not supposed to contact, it's a swift and certain set of responses. The same is true for high-risk domestic violence offenders. If they're felony DV offenders, they're also supervised under the model. Actually, one thing we've not yet been able to report on, but I can report on the data collected by the Office of the Attorney General in Hawaii, is the behavioral response and outcomes. The outcomes collected by the AG's office there for the domestic violence offenders look almost exactly the same as for the high-risk drug-involved offenders. They had very similar reductions in new arrests, reductions in violating behavior. As we found, we didn't do that study, that's theirs. But the outcomes look relatively similar. So essentially, it's just whatever the conditions of supervision are, given the underlying nature of the offense, those conditions are ideally rationalized to the things you really care about, closely monitored, and then quickly responded to if a violation is detected.
And as we improve our technology for...
Sorry.
Right.
Question was,
as we improve our technology for monitoring position, that gets to be a very effective thing to do, no matter what the offense is.
How do you approach those who have some significant mental illness?
No, this is. I think we're only beginning. Initially, when we did the work in Hawaii, a sizable share of that caseload did have mental health issues too, and our open-ended responses made us feel very comfortable with how that model was working. And many of those, and the responses from the probation officers too. The structure of it's a very structured program, and people can very clearly learn the rules, and they can have faith in those rules. It works the same way every day. It doesn't matter, and I can call my number, and if this happens, step A, step B, step C. And so in the early days, I think we felt very heartened by the responses of the probation officers as well as the probationers. I think that's really early days. I think we need to learn a lot more. We've only starting to see the research really tick up now in terms of the subsets of the population. We haven't yet really seen a well-conducted study on those with mental health conditions. The RTI study that will come out early next year is really the largest study of its kind, and I'm hoping that will give us a much better opportunity to get some sense of how this is working for different sorts of caseloads, especially those with mental health issues. So I think if we told you an answer to that now, we'd be making it up, and that's just wrong.
Any other questions?
A quick question from the phone. Can you comment on the SWIFT, certain and fair model as to how it compares with problem-solving courts that are diversion from incarceration? It reminds me, certainly, some of the benchmarks for problem-solving courts are to have an enthusiastic judge, an enthusiastic probation department, capable and competent providers in the community, and certainly a commitment to data.
Right. I think the models share many features in common, and I think as we start to write about this now, Judge Arm wrote an article, and I forget where he published it now, but I can send it out to the group, where he talks about re-envisioning community supervision, where you can think about the outpatient clinic as people who are on routine supervision, probation as usual. They just need a little dose of something, some oversight. Really, we want to supervise as little as we need to and let people get on with their lives. But people who have more serious issues, so for example, they're demonstrating they're unable to comply, well, they ratchet up to the ward, right? So more in terms of that model, more intensive supervision. And people who are in this ward now, think of Hope Courts or certain fair courts as taking care of a large number of people who have demonstrated that they've had problems. But if the next step from that, if someone's failing on a Hope model or failing on a certain fair model, if the next step is prison, what a tragedy. If the person otherwise if there's not otherwise a public safety concern, we'd really want to have another alternative, something between the Hope failure and prison. And Hawaii has done that. They retooled their drug court to accept, in our original trial in Hawaii, not a single one or very few of those offenders would have been eligible for supervision under a drug court. Their priors were simply too serious. They have retooled their drug court to take people with even serious backgrounds, and several of their drug court caseload now have prior homicides. They've retooled their drug court to take individuals who have failed out of Hope Court and need the wraparound, more intensive services of a drug court supervision. But there's no way that the drug court in Hawaii could ever supervise a caseload of 2,000 people with a dedicated drug court. The Hope Court supervises just over 2,000 with one dedicated judge, and about 10% of that population just under 10% goes on for supervision through the drug court model. And so we can really think about this as a new approach to community supervision. Very modest supervision, get out of their way if they're doing well. Hope ratcheting it up to a Hope style of certain fair supervision if they're demonstrating some problems, and then referring them to much tighter set of, but you have to have a drug court then that's willing to have these same kind of clearly articulated rules actually following through. We see a lot of variation in terms of how rigorous a drug court is in terms of supervising their caseload. If they're willing to follow those same swift, certain, fair principles, plus all the amazing resources that a drug court can bring to bear that a Hope court will never be sufficiently funded to do. So this really is kind of a triage approach now with 3 alternatives for supervision in Hawaii, and we think other jurisdictions will look to similar models now too. But we really think of them as compatible and part of a continuum of supervision.
The main thing to stress about diversion courts is just how profligate of resources they are. Typical drug court judge working full-time can handle about 50 cases because he's going to see the client once a week, once every 2 weeks, minimum once a month for probably an hour. As Angela says, Judge Am has 2,000 probationers in one courtroom. If we had every offender who needs supervision in the community on a diversion court, Every felony, every Superior Court judge in the country would have to be doing that. That's how many judges it would take to give everybody drug court. So you need to triage people, the people who don't need that, into something that doesn't use as much judge time. The key difference is that a drug court will use about a judge hour per probationer per month. And Angela, what did you figure that Hope uses 20 courtroom minutes per probationer per year? Was that the number?
Oh, I'd have to look.
Something like that.
Yeah.
But some trivial number, so you could actually do 2,000 in one courtroom. And of course, the other thing about drug courts is that they use up a lot of treatment resources because everybody has to go to treatment. If you can limit your demand on treatment resources by getting a bunch of people to get better without having to go to see a therapist once a week, that's another big improvement.
Any more questions? All right, I have one that might be more academic, but so I apologize. Is there any research on how many conditions start to how many conditions are too many conditions? Is there any kind of research that would say, you know, past a certain number, the conditions are simply just too numerous to actually, I guess, one enforce and two for the probationer or the parolee to kind of take in?
So I don't know the answer to that. I haven't seen the studies, maybe Mark has, but this is something we're trying to do now. We're trying to bring on a randomized control trial where we actually really do get the judges to commit to figuring out what exactly do you want there, make it very clearly articulated. You know, there's a book out, some of you would have seen, called Scarcity, and we have several people now talking about the book Scarcity in the context of criminal justice. It really shows if you're an individual who's living kind of on the edge, you know, paycheck to paycheck, financially strapped, other problems going on, their cognitive bandwidth is so narrow. And there's some wonderful experiments. Even if people in the room here are given kind of a cognitive overload, you know, for example, if we ask you to remember a really long number and then check in at the desk, if you're remembering this long number because you've got to keep it in your head and then you have this opportunity to do something along the way, you tend to make bad choices. So if what we can do as part of community supervision is reduce the cognitive overload, so many of our probationers and parolees are already subject to, we go a long way to helping them at least get rid of some of the noise in their heads. So we're trying to get a trial in the books. I actually think we're going to be successful. It's some challenges around this, of course, but we're trying to get a trial where we can see a reduced set of conditions and the individual really understands the rules of the game. We think it's unfair to have an arbitrary long list of conditions that no one plans to follow through anyway. And it's harder to have a credible system where you say what you mean when the list is too long. And the swift, certain, fair principles are really about having a credible system in place. We do what we say we're going to do. And if we start deviating from that, then the model starts to unravel. So I really hope that that's the future direction, that it's not just, you know, a blanket list and we copy and paste a few additional things at the end, but that we really think through the conditions much more carefully.
Because Ron Corbett is calling for zero-based conditioning.
Yeah.
All right, Judge Rob, do you want to?
Any other questions from anyone on the phone?
I have one question. How is your victim group's buy-in with these programs? Sometimes when I'm talking to victims groups, they tell me that it appears to them, and these are not academics looking at research, but they're just saying that the bar is just getting lowered. You're not getting the recidivism on the technical violations because you're not giving them any rules to break. So if I were to go back to my victim groups, what do you tell them? And specifically, you mentioned domestic violence. So the narcotics really doesn't have an identified victim group in this question. So how do you go to the victims groups and say, this is safe, this is something you should support?
Well, I think it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and the form of their model. As an example, I've been brought in to testify on behalf of the crime victims groups before that are interested in this sort of approach, especially because they want to make sure that the individuals in the community are closely monitored, so they have more faith in this alternative. Probation, as usual, is pretty watered down, and again, it depends on the jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions have a much much more rigorous version of probation. But some jurisdictions, probation is really just nothing. And those victims groups want to see that people are being closely monitored and that some response is taken. So far we've had really no backlash at all from victims groups. If anything, they've been drawing on us as a resource to help them encourage this sort of approach where these individuals who have committed these crimes against other individuals are supervised more closely.
So, I always think about the film Once Upon a Time in America, where Robert De Niro plays a Jewish mobster in New York from the 20s, and they've been running a speakeasy and gets raided, and they all have to scatter. And they have to leave sort of ordinary, unobtrusive lives for a while until the heat cools off. And the movie is they're getting back together after 10 years. And so the De Niro character encounters an old friend. He says, "So, what you been doing?" And De Niro says, "Gone to bed early." I think "gone to bed early" is a good sentence. And I think a lot of the victims' rights groups will recognize that. That people who've been getting away with living disordered lives, not living up to any responsibilities, need to be put in a situation where they have to do what they're supposed to do, and where there's a consequence for not doing it, just like the rest of us.
And here's an example, I think, where we still have to bring in the victims group. Now, Mark was talking about graduated reentry. This is still a very new concept. And a few months ago, we thought it was only a theoretical idea. We wrote a paper on it and had no idea it would actually become something that any jurisdiction would be willing to try. So we have a lot of learning to do. But here's an example where I think that would resonate with victims groups. I do a substantial amount of work in maximum security prisons, supermax prisons. A not insubstantial number of people are released from our supermax facilities directly into the public as the guards walk them through that facility on release. Which, for example, if you're in Washington, it's $40. It's $40 in a bus ticket and some clothing that looks not like a suit at all. It looks pretty much like prison gear. This is true in California too. The guards are so scared of these individuals that they push them out the door and they close the gates. So that individual has come from having complete social isolation to now moving towards the bus, where he'll hop on a bus with our children and grandparents. That model should never be allowed. Someone should never be stepped down from a maximum security prison into the public. If I was a victim's advocate, that's the first thing I would like to have removed. We have to find ways of getting, now of course, someone's got a term limit on their term, so you have to reach into their sentence. So the last 2 months or 1 month or 3 months or whatever it is, bring these people out. Ideally, bring them down through the prison structure. But that's, there's several challenges with that too. People should be releasing from level 1, not from maximum security. But it happens all the time. That sort of release has to be much more graduated. I do focus groups in custody with supermax inmates and a lot of special inmate groups. And what they tell me about reentry is that it's all about anxiety, whether it's stepping down within a prison or stepping into the community. And they'll say to me, "Angela, if you do that, if you just put me out there, I'm going to get anxious. And if I get anxious, someone's going to get hurt." I think the real goal of graduated reintegration should be to reduce the anxiety level so that people have a tiny hope of succeeding in the community. When that anxiety level is up, that's when people get hurt.
One more question. Victim support. Restitution is often very important to victims. And like what John was saying, I think it's hard for a victim to say, "Oh, I've lost all this. I'm living in, I'm on food stamps, I'm on all this other stuff, and here this person is getting a studio apartment and all that." How do you deal with that?
I think Mark
he's getting an apartment, he can't leave.
Yeah. And he has to make good on those. And he has to make good on those restitution payments deducted from his salary. I think, and again, this is something that's so new in the designing phase, but making sure that those victims are repaired to the extent that they're able to, those restitutions payments are made. And you want to make sure the person has an opportunity to succeed. You want to make sure that the court all the costs aren't so burdensome that they can never function. You want them to function, but the level of functioning can be relatively minimal. They've got their housing, they'll have the adequate nutrition. Beyond that, they should be able to make that payment back to society.
Depending, of course, on how many child support orders they have.
Well, they certainly can't make those payments from prison. At 47 cents an hour, it's going to take a whole lot longer.
Any other questions? All right. We want to thank you today from New York and California. Really appreciate your patience in getting the technology together, and thank you very much for the really interesting presentations.
Thanks for your attention.
Thank you.
Let us know if we can be helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, it is, what, 4:20? So, I do want to announce we will be meeting, the Community Corrections Committee will be meeting on September 16th from noon to 2. We'll send out more information about where it will be. It will be here. And, we'll be up here for me. It will be at the authority. I'm sorry. It will be at the authority office, 300 West. And we've invited people to speak about schizophrenia, where they see themselves going in the future. And we hope to have one other committee meeting in early October. And then in the meantime, we'll also, as a committee, be discussing all of the presentations that we've had and putting together proposals on what we think we should give back to the greater commission group. I would also indicate that the commissioners are beginning to start to go through all of the information that has been received to try and prioritize or identify that commissioners feel should be. Everybody coming today, patient with the technology as well, and for the great